Slave trade has been a long-term practice in the Americas since the British, Portuguese, and Spanish started building colonies on this land. Slaves were transported from West Africa to the Americas and then were sold to slaveholders where they were forced into labor. Once America became more populated and the colonies had their own economic systems, slave trade became a more heated topic. Slavery was very popular in the southern states due to their economy being based on agriculture. The northern states did not need as many slaves, for they were much more industrialized. Even though the North relied on raw goods from the South, the people in the North tended to not see slavery as a good thing. As states began to fight over the slavery issue, government leaders turned to the Constitution. But one of the things our founding fathers did not resolve was this specific issue. The topic of slaves had been pushed from generation to generation because nobody wanted to deal with it. Our first governmental leaders knew this would spark a war of the people, and America was not prepared for that. Our government then made a plan. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was made to keep an equal balance of free and slave states. This compromise said that every state above Missouri would be a free state, meaning Kansas would be pro-slavery. This worked for over 30 years, but some citizens felt that their states were being forced into slavery or anti-slavery. In 1854, a bill called the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed. This act repealed the Compromise of 1820 and said that each state was to decide for itself whether it would be pro or anti-slavery. This decision would be made by a popular vote called popular sovereignty. Southern citizens were very angered by this because Kansas would no longer be a pro-slavery territory. While voting in Kansas was taking place, Missourians called border ruffians began coming into Kansas and illegally voting for pro-slavery men to take office. Once Kansas caught on to this, fights broke out between the free and slave state neighbors. Tensions continued to rise, and eventually there was an all-out border war. Men from other states were coming in to join the fighting, and this encouraged the resident fighters even more. A war was coming, but nobody could have known the proportions. During the border war, abolitionists from the North were holding rallies against slavery, ransacking pro-slavery houses, and starting riots. One thing that was not expected was a massacre.
The reason that violence was inevitable was because you had a stew that was going to create it, a chemical reaction that was going to create it. You had peaceful abolitionists who weren't going to back down. You had violent, frontiers-minded Southerners who were living on the Missouri border. And you had a national issue, and it was a bit like if you've seen two dogs or cats wanting to fight each other, and it was like throwing the abolitionist cause, and the abolitionists were the ones that threw the rock that caused the fight. So yes, I really think that the peaceful abolitionists, although they had great intent of not doing anything violently, there was going to be violence over the issue here in this area, simply because it was a powder keg.
On the morning of May 24th, 1856, John Brown led 4 of his sons and 3 other men in killing 5 pro-slavery men. The men killed were James P. Doyle and his 2 sons, William and Jordyn. Also killed were William Sherman and Allen Wilkinson. This group of men was traveling to Lawrence because they had gotten word of the siege and were going to defend Lawrence. On their way there, they were informed that the siege was over, but they continued on. During the night, they captured James P. Doyle and his 2 sons William and Jordyn as prisoners and killed them while they were walking into the darkness. Owen Brown and one of his brothers killed the men with broadswords, which is a sword having a straight, flat blade. John Brown was not a part of the initial killing, but shot them in the heads to make sure they were dead. Then they went to the house of Allen Wilkinson, where he was slashed and stabbed to death by Henry Thompson and Theodore Weiner, and possibly with the help of Brown's sons. After that, they went to the house of William Sherman, where he was led to the edge of the creek and hacked to death with the swords by Weiner, Thompson, and Brown's sons. They targeted these men because they were very well-known pro-slavery men. They told my husband that he and the boys must surrender. They were their prisoners. These men were armed with pistols and large knives. They first took my husband out of the house, then they took 2 of my sons, the 2 oldest ones, William and Jordyn, out, and then took my husband and these 2 boys, William and Jordyn, away. My son John was spared, because I asked them in tears to spare him. In a short time afterwards I heard the report of pistols. I heard 2 reports, after which I heard moaning, as if a person was dying. Then I heard a wild whoop. They said they were from the army. I went in search of my father and 2 brothers. I found my father and one brother William lying dead in the road, about 200 yards from the house. I saw my other brother lying dead on the ground, about 150 yards from the house, in the grass, near a ravine. His fingers were cut off, and his arms were cut off. His head was cut open. There was a hole in his breast. William's head was cut open, and a hole was in his jaw, as though it was made by a knife, and a hole was also in his side. My father was shot in the forehead and stabbed in the breast. The Potawatomi Massacre was a turning point in American history because it was the first very well-known publicized event in the pre-Civil War time. Although there had been many fights among citizens, this was the first fully blown bloodshed to take place because of Bleeding Kansas. Why was this publicized? One main reason was that John Brown sent out press releases about himself and his actions. He was a very strong fighter and leader, and that made younger men want to start following him. He created what he called the Army of the North, which was a group of men including John Brown and his sons. The topic of slavery, of course, was a very hot topic because of the previous westward expansion and territories wanting to become states. This aroused conflict because the states had to be free or slave, and nobody could agree on it. Anyone that was so extreme was bound to be recognized at that time. He was a household name in the Kansan area well before the massacre. Once the massacre happened, though, some pro-slavery men began to think it was their time to fire back. More and more killings began to happen, and in a few years it was complete war.